Hi guys, me again, Dr. Tallman. So welcome to week 1, Introduction to Middle Level Education. So I would like you to tell me a little bit about yourself. I will post a little something on Canvas. Just the goal that you have for this class, what you're hoping to get out of it. Maybe some great show that you've binge watched lately, or some great book that you read. Something fun just to spice things up in this non-spicy COVID times. So a little bit about myself. Obviously, I'm an assistant professor at the College of New Jersey. I also adjunct for New Jersey City University because I really like the urban school feel. This is me on my daughter's wedding day, COVID style. We didn't get to have the big, beautiful wedding and the gorgeous dress and all that other stuff. It was only 10 people, only family. This crazy guy in the green shorts with blue whales on them is my hubby. This is our beautiful daughter, Madeline. This is her loving, wonderful, talented husband, Tim, who's also a goofball, so that's why I love him. And my son, my handsome, beautiful son. He works for Apple Corporate in California. My daughter is a high school teacher, which I mentioned to you guys in our chat on Thursday night for history at Northern Burlington Regional High School. And this is my little baby puppy, Delilah, who's not really a puppy. She'll be 5 at the end of this month, but she's a puppy to me. So I gave you a little bit about the course, but let me just review again. So every week, it will be set up like this. The week of February 4th for February 11th. So it's due February 10th at midnight, so by the end of the day on Wednesday. You have a weekly analytic prompt. If you click on that, you'll see it's worth 5 points. It's typing your responses to the questions on pages 5 and 9. Hopefully, I can just go back. Beautiful. Then you have your discussion board. You have the scholarly articles to help you with that. You have your guidelines for the weekly discussion board post. Let's go through this with a little more specificity so that you understand. So I really want you to engage with the reading and engage in the discussions that this will lead to on the discussion board. And obviously the papers due before the start of class. So the responses to the reading should be about 300 words each. If you write 2 paragraphs, about 150 words a paragraph. So after all the readings for the week, the articles, the books, etc., you've identified 1 to 2 key ideas or concepts that stood out to you from all the readings assigned that week. Then compare it with additional articles you have read, name the articles and sources, and give your thoughts on them. After you have identified what 1 to 2 ideas or concepts stood out to you, you will write your reaction to each idea in separate paragraphs. What did you read in the articles that led to this takeaway? Do you agree with this idea? Disagree? Did you find it surprising or interesting, etc.? To receive full credit, you have to specify the 1 to 2 key ideas or concepts. It has to be discussed and cited using APA format and textual evidence from each of the readings. That doesn't mean you have to address each of the idea in every single reading. You have to kind of take out an idea from all of them and maybe cite 1 or 2 quotes. So for this week, the discussion board prompt is just answering questions more in a narrative form because I wanted to give you some time to really digest this and understand how to do this. And then for next week, this will be your discussion board post, okay, is to analyze the readings that we will be doing. And next week is the social emotional learning of middle schoolers. So for this week, just concentrate on the Browns and Knoll responses from pages 5 and 9. Then you have to read the article Understanding Brain Development, the Young Adult State of Mind, and Browns and Knoll chapters 1, 2, and 3. So in the real world, you would be taking these 2 articles and these 3 chapters and sort of synthesizing them to give me 1 or 2 ideas that really stood out to you from them. And then writing 300 words referencing one of the articles, 1 or 2 of the readings, whatever made that concept stand out to you. Give me 1 or 2 quotes. You don't have to use every single one of the readings. I want to make that clear. So let's say in all of this, it really struck you how intriguing brain development is in the middle school mind. And maybe you took a quote from Understanding Brain Development and Brown's and Knoll, Chapter 2, and you synthesized them into 300 words to really reflect what you learned and why you were so intrigued by the brain development of middle schoolers. The directions every week are literally just what you have to do in order. And then your weekly participation, if we click on that, is the writing community that we talked about. I want you to watch the video and answer these 3 short questions. And then under this, when I'm finished the Screencastify, you'll see the link to this. Okay, so let's jump back over. And again, here's me in all my beauty. And those shoes, good Lord, all of those shoes. Although my sister Catherine's shoes, those are cute on the far left. And she's skinny, so she can make anything look good. I was always a little more well endowed, let's call it. Fluffy, if you'd like. But yeah, those 80s outfits, boy, oh boy. Okay, so why middle level education? I found 2 really great YouTube clips that I have watched before. So let's go ahead and watch them now. And again, everything that you need to watch and do is embedded, and we'll go through this week together, and probably most weeks, but there might be a week that I'm just going to leave you to go ahead and go through it on your own.
And tell them that I'm a teacher. Generally, they respond something like this. Oh. They seem appreciative, encouraging, impressed. I find that when I add the detail that I teach middle school, inevitably the response changes to something more like this. Oh. They seem betrayed, bewildered, disgusted. I'm a teacher. Oh. Of middle school students. Oh. And why do they respond like that? Probably because, even under the best of circumstances, middle school is notoriously difficult. Physically, psychologically, socially, and in a host of other ways I'm sure you do not want me to enumerate. Today, I want to talk to you about how middle schoolers can teach us to be kinder, happier human beings. Now, if you spent any sort of time with middle schoolers, or if you've just been in the same car as one for 20 minutes, you're probably already questioning my credibility. Middle schoolers? Happy? Kind? But I'm speaking from 6 years experience as a teacher and a lifetime of experience as someone who is a 7th grader emotionally. So let's get started. The first thing that we can learn from middle schoolers is to laugh. Prior to becoming a teacher, I spent several years as a semi-professional comedian, which is to say that occasionally people would give me extremely small sums of money in exchange for performing sketch or improvisational comedy. So basically, I was a professional comedian in the same way that my son is a professional raker of leaves. But given my background, the link between learning and laughter has always intrigued me. When deployed properly, humor in the classroom has serious and significant benefits, as it can help us to establish a positive and safe learning environment. It helps overcome anxiety, particularly in courses where students may doubt their ability to succeed. It also strengthens social bonds through increased dialogue between students and teachers. It inspires greater interest in the content area and even helps encourage higher level thinking. Scientists have been telling us for years that laughter also has myriad benefits outside the classroom, as it assists us with everything from meeting new people to overcoming stress, to strengthening our marriages. It seems, though, that adults struggle to implement these truths. Psychologists Rod Martin and Nicholas Kuiper conducted an experiment in which they asked adults to keep track of how frequently they laughed throughout the day. And the average was a paltry 18, or about one laugh per waking hour. Now, I guarantee that if middle schoolers did the same experiment, that number would be much higher. My students don't need convincing about the benefits of laughter. They seek silliness and cultivate fun in ways that adults just don't. Recently, I asked my students, what makes you laugh? And they said, my friends, my siblings, and when birds poop on people. Your move, adults. The second thing that we can learn from middle schoolers is to apologize. Now, something that really surprised me about teaching when I first started was how easy it is to say the wrong thing. Teachers spend their entire days in a room full of people saying thousands of words. And I find that they often end those days regretting just the handful of words that they said under duress, low on patience, in a slightly harsher tone than they intended. When I find myself in that situation, which is more frequently than I would care to admit, I make a point of seeking those students out and saying sorry to them. Because I believe that our culture doesn't really provide us great role models when it comes to apologizing. And actually, middle schoolers are better at apologizing to one another than you might guess. And I believe that's because they recognize how crucial their relationships are. Or, more to the point, they know how miserable they feel when something, anything, threatens their treasured friendships. So, they apologize. The third thing that we can learn from middle schoolers is to advocate for those who need our help. According to the U.S. Department of Education, for ages 12 through 18, 21% of students experience some form of bullying. If you sift through that data a little bit more, it turns out that middle schoolers bear a heavier burden when it comes to bullying than their older peers. For high schoolers, it's about 18%, but middle schoolers, it's more than 25%. When I was in 8th grade, my father was coming to the end of a 4-year battle with non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, which is a cancer of the lymph nodes. He had been through extensive chemotherapy and radiation treatments. He had a bone marrow transplant, but nothing was working. Around this time, a boy in my class started to take special notice of me. It was somehow as if my pain were calling to him, but not in a good way. It started as these things often do in gym class. He used his superior athleticism and his cannon of an arm to target me repeatedly in our frequent games of dodgeball. And one day, it got so bad that I just broke down and started sobbing in front of everyone. Unfortunately, though, that wasn't the worst thing that he did. The day after my dad died, I wanted to be anywhere else but in my too quiet house, so I went to school. I was sitting in art class doing something lost to memory when that same boy calibrated his comments so that they were just loud enough to hit their target, to wound, to echo across decades. Did you hear about Scott's dad? He said. He died. He's dead. He seemed so happy about it. Now, I tell that story every year to my students because I want to encourage them to be the type of people that others remember for positive reasons. But as far as I know, no one in my family has heard that story. And the reason is this. On the whole, I had a pretty positive middle school experience. I had a family that adored me. I had a close circle of friends that was #awesome. And I had treasured friends or treasured teachers who were concerned about me as a human being. But if I'm perfectly honest, the story of my bullying has a relatively happy ending because of factors over which I have little or no control. I was, and am, a white, middle-class, cisgender, Christian male. And because of that, when times got hard, I could just retreat into the world of inherited privilege that offered me safety, security, life. Obviously, not everyone is so fortunate. In fact, there are people at the edges of our communities right now who are silently struggling to survive. And still, I think this is something where middle schoolers can teach us something. According to PACER, which is a national organization seeking to eradicate bullying, 57% of school bullying scenarios stop when a peer intervenes. And students who have been bullied say that the help of a friend is much more likely to be effective than that of a teacher or a parent. What this suggests to me is that as hard as middle schoolers have it, they still understand intuitively that there's always someone somewhere who has it worse. So they look around, step in, and help out. It reminds me of the wise words of novelist Toni Morrison, who said, "The function of freedom is to free someone else." Now, you may not feel convinced that middle schoolers laugh, apologize, advocate for others. You may still question whether they are truly kind or happy. That's okay. I question it too. These are ideas that my students struggle to implement every single day. In fact, when I told my own students the topic of this talk, they openly laughed, like, "We don't do that." Still, I know the chaos that's going on in their minds, in their bodies, in their relationships, in their emotions. And so I consider the efforts that they make to be kind and happy, as futile as they may be, I think they're heroic and worthy of emulating. When you think about it, life is really just adolescence writ large. We will spend our entire time on this earth grappling with the same things that are central to the middle school experience. We're going to struggle with the ways that our bodies betray us. We're going to wonder, who are our friends really? We're going to fight with and reconcile with our family members. We are going to admit, if only to ourselves, that our parents were right all along. And we're going to wonder, how can I have my voice heard? I want to close with one more story from my middle school experience. A couple days before my dad died, my sisters, my mom, and I were spending all of our hours in his hospital room. Well, I left briefly to go to school to talk to my teachers about the assignments that I was missing. And I visited my English class, and just as I was about to leave, a friend of mine who was sitting on the opposite side of the room stood up and he ran over to me. Breathless, he asked, "How's your dad doing? How are you? Can I do anything?" That interaction probably lasted 15 seconds. But I remember it vividly more than 25 years later. And actually, it takes on greater resonance for me now that I teach 8th graders, because I understand more clearly now that friend of mine, he took a risk. He made himself vulnerable in front of all of those people, and he did it so he could communicate that he loved me. And it's moments like that where middle schoolers are willing to make fools of themselves, where they're trying really hard to do the right thing, even if it's the hard thing, even if it's unpopular. It's because of that impulse that I feel so proud to teach middle schoolers. Because we can laugh, we can apologize, we can help out other people. It's not going to take us very long, but it will be difficult. It's because of middle schoolers' willingness to do the difficult but right thing that when people recoil when I tell them what I do, I take it in stride. Because I understand that while middle schoolers are flawed and frustrating and, let's be honest, stinky, they are also resilient and courageous and beautiful. And they can teach us about how to live if only we're humble enough to listen. Thank you.
And he sums up the middle school teaching experience beautifully. And that's why I incorporated that video. And then I have one more for you also.
The earliest leaders in the middle school movement were determined to right the wrongs in the way that young adolescents were being educated. They wanted to address the shortcomings in the junior.
Please know too that from these videos, you can also pull anything you hear into that writing that you have to do every week.
Junior high school that had become too much like the senior high school. They had many clear ideas about how middle school education should look, and they possessed honorable motives for initiating change on behalf of young adolescents. In those early days, however, their individual ideas were as varied as their backgrounds. Many of the leaders were spread out geographically. In their fervor for the cause, they devoted their energy to making middle schools look and operate differently from their junior high school predecessors. It was some years before they began collectively examining and articulating their ideology about middle school education. In retrospect, some of the early leaders consider this a great weakness of the movement. With their common goal of improving education for young adolescents through action and advocacy, and with their shared passionate ideas directed towards positive change, the early participants met the prerequisite conditions for initiating a social and educational movement.
However, Bean some years later lamented,
and it's failed to take on any kind of social sense of itself, like, for example, democratic education. And I think failing to stand for something in a larger societal sense has been an obstacle in the movement.
Instead, Bean believes that the movement tried to elevate puberty to the level of an ideology, rather than to articulate clearly an ideology grounded in philosophy that is concerned with meeting the various changing needs of young adolescents. Bean's preference has always been democratic education. Similarly, John Arnold stated,
"We've never had a clear enough vision of what we want for kids. I believe we need to embody the progressive education understanding that the aim of education is the development of good people. It's who people are that counts, their character, attitudes, values, integrity."
Some of our participants believe that the early leaders did have a clear ideology, one grounded in progressive education. Among them, Arnold, Bean, Dickinson, Doda, George, and Lounsbury, who described the middle school movement as progressive education in contemporary dress. Perhaps it was not a lack of ideology that impaired the movement, but a failure to communicate that ideology clearly, widely, loudly, or consistently enough. Conceivably, those in the schools who heard and were supportive were necessarily so occupied with the organizational work and clarifying the purposes of the movement that limited time and opportunity were left to advocate for the philosophy. Nancy Doda reflected as follows.
One of the things that I'm struck by as I look back on those early conversations in middle school is that we were so caught up in this passion to try to bring feeling and heart to the middle school, to the school, to the institution, to the lives of children. So desperate to create schools in which whole human beings could be celebrated and valued, and that children would be honored as human beings as well as students. And all of that remains, I think, very critical in education. But because we were so passionate about that part of the story, we didn't articulate as clearly as we should have the connection between that and cognitive and academic achievement and learning.
Doda's comments corroborate the idea that passion and dedication among the leaders were almost tangible, but that they did not communicate their message clearly enough to those outside middle school education. Therefore, the public was left to draw its own conclusions about middle school education. Doda believes that they therefore interpreted that middle schools were really just soft, warm, fuzzy places that weren't about deep intellectual learning. Joe Lipsitz expressed some of the same concerns about failure to communicate widely enough.
Sometimes when you start something, you need for it to be protected and small and in a hothouse. But after that, if you really want to have impact, you have to say not who are the true believers, but who needs to be the true believer and how can we make that happen? Otherwise, you don't have enough impact. In the end, I think there could have been greater impact had there been a more strategic set of alliances that were forged into the world of research, into the world of public policy setting, into the major political forces in urban education. It stayed boutique too long.
Communicating the vision and ideology of the middle school movement to those outside of it is not the only issue, however. In addition, there has always been some level of disagreement about the collective middle school identity within members of the movement. This disagreement has not necessarily been a liability, however. Many of our participants suggested that a strength of the middle school movement has been that it has been open to debate. These debates among leaders have often resulted in important collective milestones. For example, in 1981, John Swaim was elected president of the NMSA. He had been involved in the NMSA since the mid-1970s, and he realized that the organization had a problem. For several years, they had been meeting, and people across the country had been committing their professional lives to middle school education. However, the organization had no official position or set of principles to support and promote middle school education. Swaim appointed a committee to develop a position statement with a clear definition of the middle school. The committee was comprised of William Alexander, Al Arth, the chair, Charles Cherry, Virginia School principal, Donald Eichhorn, John Lounsbury, editor, Conrad Tepfer, and Gordon Vars. John Swaim recalled thinking that it might take about 6 months for the group to write the document. In the end, it took about 2.5 years.
And I can almost guarantee you every word was fought over in that document. We just about lost a couple members off of that committee that resigned from the committee. And I still have the letters from them saying that we were defining middle school too much, that it was more of a philosophy, and we were trying to make a checklist out of it. And God bless John Lounsbury. He worked with me and those people that they stayed with it, so forth. And we did some revisions and so forth. But in actuality, we believe that there was 10 components. And it got turned into a checklist in many respects and so forth. But it was a start, So, I think there are there's room in middle school for a lot of philosophical interpretation of what middle school should be all about. And you take our founders, even in those early years, there were some, we shouldn't be saying that everyone should have to have teaming, or should teaming be in there, or how do we define this, or are we defining it too much, or should this be more free flowing? And I think some of those debates, still go on in maybe a little different arena.
In 1982, the Middle School Association published This We Believe, its landmark position statement about the organization's vision for schools for young adolescents. Many of our participants cite the publication of this document as one of the most significant events in the history of the middle school movement because, as Cheryl Bergman notes, it gave schools a set of standards and a philosophy to implement. Subsequent editions of This We Believe were published in 1995, 2003, and 2010 as participants in middle school education have continued to learn and grow and debate ideas. Paul George spoke to the power of evolving ideas.
The middle school concept is a cauldron of ideas. And that's one of the things that's kept me interested all these years, is that we keep unfolding what the middle school means.
These debates and struggles to come to agreement have often pushed the movement forward, but have led to what some see as the movement having two distinct wings. Being explained.
But think about the middle school movement as having two wings, one much larger than the other. The largest one is what I would call the mainstream middle school movement. And that is people who are certainly caring about young adolescents. They speak well of young adolescents. They enjoy young adolescents. They are mostly interested in structural changes in the middle schools, and in a sense, as we used to say with the curriculum work, what they're interested in is trying to, and I don't mean this to be critical, but what they're interested in is really engaging activities, in a sense, trying to find what bait to put on the hook to pull the kids in. So there is that kind of mainstream group, and it's the largest group, and they've been incredibly important, and they're extremely well-intentioned, and I have great respect for them. And I don't mean to be critical. And then there's the other wing to which I would belong, which is the progressive wing of the middle schools movement, which not only is trying to be responsive to young adolescents, but also believes that the movement should be addressing larger social issues and obligations. In 1968, in a conversation with Connie Tepfer, he said to me, he said, the thing about most educators, child-centered educators, is they don't understand that if you really love children, you have to hate the things that crush their souls. You have to hate racism, and you have to hate sexism, and you have to hate poverty. And I never forgot that. And I think probably if I were to explain my work in the middle school movement, it wouldn't be about trying to find a way to integrate subject areas. It would be about a search for a democratic curriculum and a curriculum with a social conscience.
The middle school ideology, then, has been characterized somewhat differently for those who have spent much of their professional lives inside it. At its core is the intent to provide the best possible education for young adolescents. Individuals who have been involved and have established their own positions about how that education might look and even why it is important. Among our participants, the attraction to educating young adolescents has often had a spiritual dimension. Dota and Erb called it a moral imperative, and George Johnston and Lounsbury characterized it as a mission. Cheryl Bergman explained.
It was such a commitment, such a deep, unselfish involvement in the whole bettering the lives of children at that age group that you just couldn't help but be brought into it.
Perhaps the middle school movement is still in search of its ideology and identity, and perhaps the efforts to continue the search, to keep moving forward toward the quest for an appropriate education for young adolescents, has been what has kept so many involved in the journey.
Okay. So a little dry, but fascinating and important, I think, for your future responses and for the readings. So to sum up, middle schools were created to kind of separate from junior high schools and high schools. And it was kind of meant to be that students learn from the total experience of school, not its isolated parts, which is very telling, because we don't really always practice that as teachers. We get so subject matter specific. I teach history, I teach math, I teach science, that even in the elementary grades, well, from 10 to 1020 is ESL, and from 1020 to 1050 is math. And it's the total experience. The middle school concept, it's developmentally responsive. It's understanding the developmental uniqueness of the young adolescent. And we're going to get a little bit more into that next week. So physical development in young adolescents, it's really ages 10 to 15. It's more dramatic of a change than any other time except in utero and infancy. They really require a lot of acceptance and empathy. And teaching middle school is not a job for those whose primary inspiration as an educator is the transmission of content. Curricula takes a back seat to relationships. And I can't stress this enough, ladies and gentlemen. And I really feel like it's not just with middle school, but particularly in middle school. Everything is about your relationship. I have been invited to weddings, baptisms, bar mitzvahs, graduations, college graduations from former students. I have received letters. I've been noted in speeches. And I tell people all the time that teaching, you won't make much money, but the rewards, the benefits to teaching are beyond even your wildest dreams. To affect a child's life in a positive way, there's nothing better. And not one of those students who have ever come back to thank me, to note me in something that went on, some of them to do amazing things, said, wow, she really taught me the difference between, colons and semicolons. Wow, she changed my life with her unit on Mesopotamia. No, it was the relationship we formed. It was the kindness I extended them. It was the rapport that we had. Because children don't learn from people they don't like. And that does not mean that you are to be their friend, because you're not. You're in a more respected position than that. But they do need to like you. Otherwise, they will never learn from you. They are very preoccupied with self-examination. And I try to tell them all the time, don't worry about what you look like, because the only person looking is you. Because everyone else in this building is so preoccupied with themselves, nobody's paying any attention to what you're doing unless it's to deflect attention from themselves. The most significant skeletal and muscular changes for girls happens at 10, for boys at 12. Adolescents put an average of 10 pounds on per year and grow more than 4 inches per year in that window. Bone growth surpasses muscular growth, which is why they're awfully clumsy and gangly in those middle school years and don't seem to be as coordinated, because their bones are growing far faster than their muscles, and they just haven't caught up in order to be more coordinated. The hormones run amok, and their appetite is insatiable. So cognitive development, let's talk about declarative learning. It's a higher level of learning that leads to greater applicability and is deeply rooted in long-term memory, okay? There are 3 forms of thought. Concrete, where they really need hands-on learning. Formal, where they're beginning to think hypothetically. They're starting to think about the future. And metacognition, they're very reflective of their own thoughts, and they're thinking more about the way they think and feel and act. The highest levels of reasoning are attained when individuals are given a chance to discuss, argue, and debate. So that means anything that you do in a middle school curriculum, The more chances you give them to discuss, argue, and debate points of view really help them to grow and really hone in on where their brain is and how it's developing. So I would often include debates in many of my classes because it really sparked and hit home for them where it was that they were cognitively. They're also big risk takers, which I love about middle school. Not, oh, I'm going to skateboard off the roof of the building. More, I'm going to say something that's kind of out there and see what the response is. So let's watch this short clip, maybe, on cognitive development.
Tell you a story about Yvette. A great teacher understands that they have a life outside of school.
Oh, sorry.
They really do.
I don't know why I did that. This one's great. He's really very good.
I'm obsessed with the question, what makes a good teacher great? I've collected 26,000 responses to this question in 8 different schools, from the poor schools in Los Angeles to suburban schools in Texas to elite private schools abroad. And after 24 years of teaching students, I'm still perplexed by this question. Today, I'm going to teach you the lessons I learned from those thousands of students and learn what I found out from them if we just listen to students. The thing about it is that during my time of asking kids this question, I realized that we don't ask this question for a particular reason. Schools are afraid. Based on fear, they don't really want to know what kids think, partially because they don't think kids will take it serious. I'm going to share with you one of the most profound quotes, answers to this question that I ever received. Now, I know what you're thinking. Doesn't this prove my point? Great teachers eat apples. When I first saw this, I dismissed it as silliness. But it appeared again and again. So I thought there's got to be something to this. But what are they trying to tell me? So one day I decided I would start eating apples. I ate them in the morning, at lunch, during class, in the hall. Kids began to give me apples. They'd see me eating them and say, "You're eating an apple." I know. They would smile, and I would smile back. It wasn't until I understood that kids wanted to see me as somebody who was willing to receive a gift from them, that the apple was a symbol for our relationship. There was goodness in that and trust. But for a long time, I wasn't listening, and I hadn't understood this. They have their own language. When they say a great teacher is chill, what they really mean is don't take it too serious. Be calm in all situations. Don't get overwhelmed. They have a way of speaking to us about what they really want to tell us, but we have to listen, right? I'm the father of 2 grown kids. They're out of school now and in college. But when they were at home and they were teenagers, I had to learn a whole new language. When they would come home from school, I might ask them, "How was your day?" And they would say, "Fine." Which usually meant it was not bad, it was pretty good. Nothing happened eventful. I probably learned something, maybe I didn't. But if they came home and said, "Fine," what they meant was, it wasn't really great, but don't ask me because you wouldn't understand anyways. If I asked them how their day was and they said, "Okay," what they were trying to tell me was that it wasn't good at all, and you should probably ask me more questions, but don't expect me to answer. Kids have their own language. They have their own way of thinking. They want us to think like them and understand what's inside of their head. They have so many ways of thinking that things are great. They want us to see the world inside of them. But they don't want us to act like them. They want us to be calm and protect them and keep them safe. Kids have a way of communicating, and adults just haven't spent the time listening. But what if we did? What if we really listened deeply to students? One of the things I noticed after all the years of collecting these responses is that there's patterns that emerge. When I asked the question, what makes a good teacher great? Oftentimes I heard a great teacher loves to teach. 70% of the time, the quote or the answer that followed was, a great teacher loves to learn. The reason this is significant is they don't see this happening. They don't see teachers learning in front of them. They see them teaching, but they wish they would learn along with them. Think about it. Principals hire teachers to be content experts, to have all of the knowledge, not to be learners. But what if they did? What if you showed up in the classroom and the teacher had something prepared and said, I don't know exactly what we're going to do today, but I can't wait to learn with you. Or that they saw their teacher struggle through something they didn't actually know and then eventually discovered the answer. Kids want to be inspired by this idea that learning is important, but they don't see it in schools. When I saw this quote, a great teacher isn't a teacher, I actually was a little bit offended. What do you mean? I'm a teacher. They're like, we know. What they were trying to tell me is a great teacher isn't in the classroom. Think about it. Think about a time that you have some enduring understanding, a time when you learned something that you still remember and use to this day, like throwing a baseball or riding a bike. I remember learning to ride a bike from my mom when I was 5 years old. She took off the training wheels of my bike. She got behind me and began to push. And we ran until she finally let go and I began to ride a bike. That's what I did. That's how I learned to ride a bike. I can still ride a bike to this day from that moment. But can you imagine if I tried to learn a bike from my mom in a classroom? What it would look like? Son, first, you need to learn all the parts of a bike. There's a pedals and a crank, and there's a chain that turns the wheel. You have to give significant force. Once the force has enough momentum and you can keep your balance, that's how a bike works. I want you to learn all the parts, be able to label them and draw them. Then you're going to learn and write a research paper about the history of bike riding. All the important elements, the adventure, the developments of bikes. And at the end of that, you're going to take a final examination. If you pass and get an A, you can ride a bike. At 5 years old, I think I would have said, never mind, I'll just walk. This is exactly what we do to children. We put them in a classroom and tell them, this is what I want you to learn. It's important, do it. And kids know that it's not true, that we don't really value learning this way. So no wonder they're disruptive or bored or disengaged. Kids want us to be teachers that aren't teachers. I want to tell you a story about Yvette. A great teacher understands that they have a life outside of school. They really do. They want us to know that their life in school is way more different than the life outside of school. I just thought, well, how hard is your life? Your job is to do school. My job is to teach. Yvette was a tough student. She was feisty, and she had an infamous reputation. She walked around with the jacket to prove it. Whenever she walked around, the kids would follow. She would come in and sit in the front row and lean just so she could make eye contact to intimidate me. She would call me Mr. and not even use my full name. When she get up to go to the bathroom, all the girls would follow. Eventually, I learned from Yvette what she needed to learn. And I thought I became pretty good at what I was doing. I noticed one day she stopped turning in her homework, which she had become a great leader in the classroom. She turned in her homework. She participated in class. She actually was quite good. So when this happened, I was surprised. So I went up to her and said, Yvette, I'm very disappointed in you. She said, I know, mister, I'm sorry. I expected and turned in tomorrow. Tomorrow came, and just a few sheets of unfinished work were turned in. I also went up to her and said, Yvette, this is disappointing. She said, I normally do my homework in the bathroom because it's the quietest place in my house. But this week the electricity was turned off and it's dark in there. I had a candle, but it burnt out, and I'm sorry. She gazed down, nodded her prideful self. I had missed the point. I had not listened when she said, I'm trying, mister. I heard the words, but I didn't listen. Great teachers notice when there's a struggle. They don't make assumptions about what kids can and cannot do. They wait and watch, and they rescue them when they're stuck. Good teachers hear them, but they don't listen. I'll never forget Yvette. I'm grateful because whenever I see an answer of a student like that, I remember her and I listen. This was the most perplexing answer I think I ever received. It happened every year for 10 years. At least one student would put this. A great teacher sings. What are they talking about? I can't sing. So I started saying, wait a second. What do they mean? It wasn't until Danny turned it in as one of his responses. He was the class clown. You know, he was the one that when we took a class picture, he put your fingers behind your head. He would make faces at me during lectures so I would laugh. Everything was a joke to Danny. So when he turned in his responses, and they were all serious and actually really good, I was surprised when this showed up in the middle. But I knew there was something to it. I just didn't know what. So the next day, I put the agenda on the board, listing all the activities of the day, the expectations, and the homework. And instead of actually reading them, very seriously, I sang. In operatic style, big as I could. The eyes of the students were wide, their mouths dropped. But you know what happened? At the end of that, I expected pointing and laughing, but the classroom erupted in cheers and applause. There was a standing ovation. I could not believe it. At the end of class, they walked out, gave me high fives and handshakes, and here came Danny. He walked in and he leaned in and patted me on the shoulder and said, I told you a great teacher sings. Great teachers make themselves humble before their students. They take risks. They put aside their fear to try. They trust that they're going to be supported if they fail. But they don't see this. They see experts, remember? Content experts. What if we hired teachers not to be deep understanding of content, knowledge keepers, but deep understanders of students? How our schools would change and transform. But it's no wonder students don't care, or that teachers don't really listen, because they've never been taught. But what if we did listen? You see, we spend 3 years of a student's life teaching students to read. About 12 years of those students' life teaching them to write. Maybe if they're lucky, they get a semester or half a year learning to public speak. But they get virtual 0 years of formal listening instruction. 0. Think about it. When was the last time you were at a dinner party and someone asked the question, so what do you do for a living? And the response was, Oh, I'm a listening teacher. I teach advanced listening at the high school, advanced listening communications or beginning listener for elementary. We don't hear this because we just don't believe it in schools. It's important. Though in the world, listening is one of the number one skills essential for business and life, and we just don't teach it. We need to listen to our students. In our classrooms are the future. The Maya Angelous, the Mother Teresas, the Elon Musks of the world. And can you imagine if we took the time to ask those students what would make a good teacher great? And then we actually listened. We could transform schools and education. Thank you.
And it's so true. Great teachers listen. And we get so confined in our boxes. We get so attached to our curriculums and making sure that we check all the boxes to get the kids to the end of the year that we miss making the relationships that will naturally check all those boxes because they want to hear what we have to say. And we have to be careful too that we plan lessons that address the cognitive development of middle schoolers, that we hit them where they live so that there can be real understanding. And you're going to read in your book, if you haven't already, I'm not sure which chapter it's in, that so many times middle schoolers answered, I don't know why I did that. Because that's the truth. The synapses in their brain aren't completely wired yet to really understand their actions. And it's the time in their lives that they are most aware of the behaviors around them, of what we as their teachers are modeling for them. Huge impact that we have as teachers in middle school. And then finally, brain development. So let's watch this short clip, and I try to infuse clips that I think are relevant, that I think are important, and that I think are really interesting and good so that you're not listening to me for 2 hours. But this addresses it very nicely, and this one is short.
The adolescent period is absolutely amazing. People often give it a negative approach, saying, oh, it's a time where adolescents are going to lose their mind, or they're just immature, or raging hormones drive them crazy. These are all not only wrong, but they're myths that mislead us and actually disempower us. Whether we're adults or adolescents, they actually give us the wrong message and they make it so there's nothing we can do. So what is actually the truth? The truth is that instead of raging hormones, what's happening is we have remodeling in the brain. In ways we never predicted, we now understand two big things are happening in the brain. Things you as an adult can support adolescents in developing well. And if you're an adolescent, you actually can use this to help your brain grow in an optimal way. What are those two things? The brain is pruning itself. So imagine that in childhood, you're growing like a tree and establishing all these branches and all these leaves are growing. In the brain, that means connections among the basic cell, the neuron, called synapses, are being established. And you're soaking in the knowledge of the world, and that's beautiful. The tree is just growing, growing, growing. But then what happens that surprised everyone is the brain begins to prune itself. You start carving away some of those leaves, some of the smaller branches, even some of the larger branches. And the reason for the pruning is to specialize the brain. While the child is developing in ways that are really generalized, learning everything they can about everything they can, an adolescent is going to begin to find their passion, to actually find things they like, things they really love doing, and to drive their development in that way. So pruning is actually a use it or lose it principle underneath it. That if you don't use something, you're going to lose it. So if you like sports or like dancing or like music, do those things so you continue to establish those circuits. The second thing that happens in the remodeling adolescent brain is myelin formation. Myelin is a healthy sheath that allows connected neurons to communicate with each other in a much more effective way. How? It's 100 times faster, the signal that's sent down a neuron to communicate with another neuron, 100 times faster, and after it fires off, it's 30 times shorter, the resting period that happens. 30 times 100 is 3,000. So when you've put down myelin, you've made your neurons communicate 3,000 times more effectively. That's a great thing. Now, the great thing too is that you as an adolescent can actually use the focus of your attention to be aware of your emotions, aware of other people, to be engaging in activities, to be doing things with your thoughts that actually reinforce the parts of your brain you want to hold on to. So the good news about the remodeling story is that a field called neuroplasticity, how the brain responds to experience, shows us that what you do with your mind can change the activity and therefore the structure of your brain. So if you then come up with the statement that the ultimate goal of brain remodeling is to make an integrated brain, to differentiate areas, that's the pruning, and myelinate them, that's the linkage. When you increase differentiation and linkage, you make the brain more integrated. And an integrated brain is the pathway toward well-being. And you can do mind-sight exercises. These are exercises that increase insight, empathy, and integration. And if you do them as an adolescent, and you can also do them as an adult, you'll actually increase the integration of your brain as your brain is growing, not just during adolescence, but throughout the lifespan. And what's the outcome of integration? When integration is made visible, it's kindness and compassion. And so what we see through adolescent development is that our relationships become built on connections that are deep and filled with honoring each other's vulnerability, that's kindness, and supporting connections that are compassionate, filled with a sense of caring about other people and wanting to help them. This is the kind of world we can build as we move through life and support each other in our development.
Fascinating stuff, right? And I want you to think about what was your passion in middle school. So he talked about those passions and that pruning, that use it or lose it for philosophy. And then I want you to take those passions that you had and imagine a classroom full of them and the possibility that you have as a middle level teacher. And then let's just watch this short clip because this one also is fascinating.
When we think about changes that happen during puberty, we usually think about changes that happen to the body. Things like the development of secondary sex characteristics or changes in height or an increase in body hair. But those aren't the only changes that happen. There are actually a lot of changes that happen to the brain as well. And here I have an image of a brain, and this is what you would see if you looked at the side of the brain. So here is the front towards the face, here's the back, and then over here I have another brain, and this brain is sliced in half. So this brain is sliced right down the middle. And these two brains are facing each other, so here's the front, and then here's the back of this one. And one of the major changes that we see during adolescence is the development of the frontal lobe, particularly the prefrontal cortex. And I'll roughly indicate where on the brain that is. And this is the area of the brain that is responsible for what scientists call higher order cognition. Things like thinking about the future and planning and decision making. And also the ability to inhibit certain behaviors and focus on long-term goals. And this part of the brain doesn't really stop maturing until our early 20s. And because it is still developing during the teenage years, because it isn't fully developed, this might help to explain why teenagers sometimes show poor judgment. Another area of the brain that continues to develop during adolescence is the limbic system. And this includes a number of different brain structures. And this image isn't really the best way to view them because a lot of the structures are on either side of the midline. Even so, I want to point out about where they are in the brain. And one structure included in the limbic system is the amygdala, which would be about here. And this is the part of our brain that's responsible for emotions and emotional responses. And it also includes the hypothalamus, which is here, and Let me pick a slightly different color for that. And this part of the brain regulates a surprising number of things. But in particular, I want to focus on its role concerning the endocrine system, or the hormone system in our bodies. And to be clear, the limbic system includes a bunch of other structures as well, but I really want to focus on these two, because in combination with the prefrontal cortex, which helps to regulate our emotions, the fact that these structures are still developing during the teenage years might help to explain why teenagers can sometimes be moody, why they might sometimes have emotional outbursts, like yelling at their parents and stomping out of their room and slamming the door. And while I think that this is kind of funny, and while it kind of makes me want to roll my eyes when teenagers act out, this does actually have some really important legal implications. Like whether or not we should be able to charge teenagers like adults when they commit certain crimes. And this is a question that I put to you. Should teenagers get the same treatment as adults if they commit the same crimes? Should they be able to be sentenced to death or to life in prison for acts that they commit prior to turning 18? Do you think that this is a good boundary? Are crimes committed 1 month before someone's 18th birthday really different from crimes that they commit 1 month after? Where should this boundary be? How should we define adulthood? And these are really difficult and serious questions. And it's really not clear what role developmental research has in solving these problems, or if it should even have a role at all. Putting that very serious question aside, another area of the brain that changes during adolescence is the corpus callosum, which you can see here. And this is the area of the brain that connects our left and right hemispheres. And there are a number of things that change about this structure during adolescence. But in particular, I really want to focus on the changes to connections that are associated with language and language learning. And these connections grow before and during puberty, but this growth stops soon afterwards. And this might help to explain why learning a second language is so much easier in childhood as compared to adulthood. So we see changes to those specific brain areas, but there are also other more global changes that are happening in the brain during this period, or changes that are happening throughout the brain. And one thing that we see during this period is an increase in myelination, especially in the areas that are associated with higher order functioning. And to quickly review, this is a neuron, and neurons communicate with each other by sending signals down these long axons. And myelin is a fatty tissue that covers the axons of neurons and helps to increase the speed at which the neurons can communicate. And faster communication between neurons means faster communication between brain areas. And this can help explain why adolescents are able to process information faster than children. Another thing that we see during this time period is that there's an increase in brain volume during early adolescence, and then this shrinks during late adolescence. And this suggests that adolescence is a period of synaptic pruning, or cutting weak connections in the brain. So this is your body literally breaking down connections between neurons. And you might initially think that this is a bad thing, but this pruning is actually really good and it's really important because it allows the body to focus energy and resources on the connections that are used most. And a kind of scary implication of this is that what we do during our teenage years might be literally shaping our brains for the rest of our lives. That there's kind of a use it or lose it principle at work here. So if we spend our free time reading or playing sports or focusing on academics and having good time management skills, then that's what's going to be reinforced. The parts of the brain that are responsible for those behaviors are physically going to be strengthened. But if we spend most of our time watching TV and sitting on our couch and procrastinating, that's what's going to be strengthened instead.
Crazy, right? So I want you to think about, given those videos, what's happening to the brain during adolescence. And then it is interesting to pose the question, should teenagers be tried as adults? Are they adults in making these decisions? And she poses an interesting question. And you know, what's the difference between 1 month before your 18th birthday and 1 month after? And is 18 really when you are an adult? Or is it just when you're legally considered to be an adult? So definitely, if you want to join office hours next Thursday at 5:30 and join the chat, we can talk about all of these things. The writing community post is posted on the slide. Let me just go back there. It's the weekly participation. So that's right there. I'm not going to get into any of the projects. I really just wanted to introduce them to you tonight, just to kind of get your brain thinking. All of these videos that we've watched, all of the readings that you've done, this will all come out as you go through that mid-semester project and that final project, because you'll show me your clear understanding of the middle school mind. So